All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. We'll let whoever shows up trickle in. If not, they can watch the recording afterward. So happy Monday morning to you. I know it's always early on Monday morning to get started, but hey, the week has begun and it's time to get down to business. So today is kind of an interesting one. I've found through teaching a long time that what I used to have as lecture and exercise 105 and lecture and exercise 106 really belong together. And so I've created a mashup of the two, pulled some stuff and kind of reorganized a little bit. But in order to keep my numbering correct, I combine this together so that it's exercise or it's lecture 105/106. So don't be confused by the numbering. It's still the same length of lecture. It's still the same length of your exercise that you're going to be working on today. So don't really panic about the fact that they're kind of smushed together, but it keeps us more on track and it keeps my numbering in the correct orders going forward. So we're going to go ahead and get started with that. Give me a second to share my screen, and then we'll start on lecture for today. And of course, I want to get organized here. Perfect. Let me pull up that chat window. All right, and let's pull this up. Perfect. So today we're talking about three different things. The first one is high dynamic range. The next one is panoramas. And the last one is blending modes. And the key today, or the key takeaway, is really about blending modes and masking. And so we'll introduce those concepts. You'll have a much better understanding of what's happening, and then we'll push forward into some more advanced techniques. So let's start with high dynamic range photography, or HDR photography. And I mentioned this a little bit in the first photography lecture, where I was talking about being able to kind of fuse images together. Well, now it's a little bit more in depth on that. And essentially what we're talking about is we're being able to see an image, a static image, the way that our eye sees a scene. And the difference is that our eyes and our brains are really good at processing what we're seeing quickly. So we can understand what's dark, what's light, and what's in between just as we glance around. And you can do this as an actual illustration. If you look around your room, if you look down by your feet, it's kind of dark and in the shadows, but your eyes can still pick out details and they can still see what's going on in that area, etc. And then if you look up at kind of the middle ground, you can look around and you can see that, yeah, I can see everything that's there. Now today is not a good example because it's cloudy outside, but if it was a bright sunny day, you could also flip up, look out the window and see what's going on there. In the world of photography, however, we can only expose for one of those at a time. And that becomes very challenging. So to create an image like this would be inherently difficult without the use of high dynamic range photography. And so what we do is we take three images. Our first one is this would be image number one. That first image would be what our camera thinks is appropriate for the light settings. So it's kind of that middle of the road. The darks aren't too dark, the lights aren't too light, it's kind of middle exposure. Then we take a second image right there that's deliberately darker than the first image. And by doing this, we're trying to capture the lighter areas of the scene in more detail. So in this area, it would be the part of the sky that would otherwise get washed out. Then we take a third image, and that's the opposite, where we're trying to expose for the shadows. So the detail down in here on the beach and the rocks and stuff, we're trying to expose to see that detail. Then we take all three of those images and we fuse them together into one image. And so that gives us this greater range of luminances within the image. So we're able to see detail and contrast within the dark areas of the image, within the middle areas of the image, and within the lighter areas of the image. And so this is a process to kind of create this. So why would we do it in the first place? Well, there's artistic reasons. Maybe we want to more accurately represent the light intensity levels that are found in real scenes. Maybe you want to capture that sunset scene and have it look like a sunset, like what you saw. It's also a way of mimicking how we see a scene. And this is a perfect example. You take a picture of the sunset and you look at it afterwards and you say, it doesn't look like the sunset that I saw. Well, that's because your brain and your eyes are processing this differently. So we try to mimic that. We might also use them as background imagery for renderings. So those of you that have taken 136 already, we've talked a lot about HDRI images, background images. Well, we can use these images to change exposures during rendering after the fact. So we can take that raw image, that HDRI image, and adjust it based on current rendering conditions in a particular scene. Not something we'll do in this class, but I like to introduce it because those of you that'll take 136 or have taken 136, you'll see that similarity. Tone mapping is the process by which we take the high dynamic range image and we make it lower dynamic range such that we can see what's happening. So we apply this series of techniques to preserve or exaggerate local contrast. And depending on how we do it, it could be artistic or it could be just photorealistic. So we're trying to be able to see the shadows as well as the light areas of a particular image. This tone mapping reduces the overall dynamic range of the entire image while retaining localized contrast. So we're still seeing contrast in the shadows, we're still seeing contrast in the light areas, but overall the contrast is different. So it's not something that you can apply to an image and get this result without fusing those three images together to begin with. It could, I should say. I say 3 because that's most common, but it could be 3, 5, or 7 images. So how do we do this tone mapping in the first place? Well, there is some standalone software that is specialized for doing this. We can, of course, use Photoshop. And we talk about Photoshop extensively in this class. That's obviously what we'll use to do this. It's an automated action where we merge to HDR, and then there's some post-processing that we can do through the dialog box. It's actually gotten a lot better than it used to be at dealing with these HDR images. So we'll walk through that in a live demonstration a little bit later. The cool thing is, of course, now you have a subscription to it, so you have access to Photoshop. Photomatix is really the gold standard of doing this. People that do this professionally or for a living use Photomatix to do this post-processing. You can get it as a plugin for Photoshop. You can get it as a standalone application. And depending on what version, you have some expense there to get it. But if it's something you're really interested in doing, you can get high quality results out of it. So I like to introduce it so at least you're aware that it's there. Aurora Hdr is another example that allows this merging to happen. They use what they call artificial intelligence to help you figure out what the tone mapping should be. And they also have plugins for Photoshop or for Photos or Lightroom, etc., that you can use. So let's look at some examples. And I think this is always an important one because the more we see examples, the more we can understand. So these are the realistic examples. So why would you use it? To me, this is the perfect real world scenario of why high dynamic range is important. So let's say that you were going to rent an office building or rent a space, rent a flat, and you were looking through real estate listings for it. And this image on the top, this first image here, was the one that showed up. Well, if you looked at this image, you say, yeah, it looks kind of like it's on a high floor. And I bet there's probably some kind of a view out here, but I can't really see it. So yeah, maybe it's worth going to see, maybe it's not. The high dynamic range version of the same image, so we're looking down here at the same image, when we switch to high dynamic range, we get a much better sense of what's happening in the space. There's not nearly the shadows. If we look at the ceiling, for example, not nearly the shadows that there are up top. But the big part is that right here, looking out those windows, we could see the view. We have an understanding of what floor we're on. We have an understanding of how high we are. So you're really selling the space. This is not overly dramatic. It's not trying to push the boundaries. It's not becoming artistic. It's merely showing us what the space really is like. And that's a key component to these. And you'll see them used a lot in real estate photography. So here's another set of examples. We've got the standard photography on the left. We've got the high dynamic range on the right. And you can see that there's a significant difference. So if we look at the bottom image to start, look at this corner right here. If we look at that corner right there, you can see how dark it is in the standard photography. And if we jump over and look at that same spot right here, look, we're seeing all the detail. We're seeing the floor, we're seeing the shadows. We can't even tell that there's a floor plug right here in this image. It's not there because it's too lost in the shadows. Furthermore, if we look at the window, right there, you can't see the buildings very well. You can't see what those neighboring buildings look like. The church down here at the bottom is all washed out. But if we look over across at this image, we can see the buildings. We can see the church. We can see all of that detail. So it's really helping us to sell this particular piece of real estate. Same thing in the top example, but I think the bottom example is easier to see. Another example of just kind of the general lightening of the image, the general definition. Kind of a twilight night view. It's a good time where this HDRs really come into play because you lose the shadows. Sometimes the images look rather normal, but you can tell the difference in the darker shadowed areas. That's always where the detail comes out in a high dynamic range image. Again, that kind of night scene, this would be so much better if we crop the image right here and followed a rule of thirds if we got rid of this part. Sorry, I have to throw that in there. Again, subtle, but we wouldn't be seeing any of this detail right down at the bottom if it were a regular image. Now, we do have some problems that can occur, and I like to use this one as an example of those problems. And that is that when things move in this scenario, we get ghosted artifacts in our scene. So remember, these are three separate images that are taken together consecutively that are then fused. So what happens when somebody's moving in a scene? You might lose a head. You might get three versions of a car. There's the license plate, there's the license plate, because something's moving in the scene. So these work great when we have static images, but when we have a lot of movement or a lot of chaos, we end up with these kinds of artifacts. And that's something to be aware of when you're shooting high dynamic range. Another example here where there is no moving objects. So a lot of these I can just flip through. I'm just trying to get you a sense for what's happening in these kinds of images. And you've seen some of these sunset ones before. These are all ones that I took. And actually, some of these are the samples that you can play around with later today. So those were the photorealistic examples. Then we can move into the creative examples. This is where we're stretching the boundaries of what high dynamic range can do, and in so kind of adjusting the properties so that things may become a little bit more surrealistic. So there's something about this image that's kind of like, it's almost haunted. It has this foggy quality to it. And so we can push the boundaries. It's still quasi-realistic, but as we jump forward, you can see that we can push those boundaries. This probably doesn't look this haunted. The sky doesn't look that dark and gray, but a little bit of that post-processing can get us there. The sky here is almost painterly in how it's done. I think this is a great example. You guys have been to the Golden Gate Bridge before, and it doesn't look like this. The clouds don't look like this. I mean, I guess on those rare, really smoky days, maybe it does, where we get the orange sun. But in this scenario, it's not really this dark. So they've pushed the boundaries of what this high dynamic range is really doing. So this may or may not be your intended end result, but at the same time, it's certainly an option for what it is that we're doing.
What do we mean by pushing the boundaries? It's mean that we need to take a lot of pictures in order to, and merge a lot of pictures in order to get to this result?
No, if you want to do something more like that, it's just a matter of how you tweak the settings when you do the merge to HDR. So I can show you today, when we do the actual live examples, how easy it is to kind of push it into this photoreal or the creative realm. Okay. So you still need the same three images. It's just how you do the merge to HDR. So I'll show you today. This one is just a reminder that you can have high dynamic range panorama images. We'll talk about panoramas in the next section in just a bit, but you can have both. They work together. So I'm just going to keep flipping through these. To me, like this one here, the wood texture is the obvious piece that's just overblown. This one's just kind of the mood So let's now move into panoramic photography. So that was high dynamic range. And again, when we get to the demo portion today, I'll show you specifically how to do that part of the processing. Panoramas, it'll be the same. Let's talk about the general concepts of panoramic photography. So what is a panorama, fundamentally? It's a really wide angle of view or representation of a space. What's considered a 360 panorama is essentially a full 360-degree view. Now, that could be a 360-degree view horizontally, or it could be a full 360 both horizontally and vertically. So when we get to panoramic photography, fundamentally it involves stitching multiple images together to create this very wide angle. Now, you guys are all probably familiar with your phone's panorama mode. And I asked you not to use it when I gave you those sample images earlier in exercise 103. But what essentially your phone is doing is it's on the fly stitching images together. So when you get your phone out and you say, okay, I'm going to do panorama. When you swing that phone, your phone is stitching the images together all at once to create that panorama. We can do it after the fact in Photoshop, where we actually overlay images together. That's what we'll do today. So you can actually take multiple images and fuse them together. There are some mechanics that do help us get better results. So when we're taking these images, and this is a classic one, because we're all used to our phones where we pull them up and then we swing our phones around, etc. If we instead move ourselves around our phone as we take it, rather than moving our phone, we'll get better results. What happens is something called parallax. And I'm going to skip forward here so you can see this, and then we'll come back to those slides. Parallax is when pieces don't line up. And you can usually see it in things like power lines, right? Or painted lines on the ground. It's when those little lines don't match when you're taking these panoramas, right? There's a big parallax problem where you can see the image, they're separate images and they're not merging together correctly. So we can solve that problem when we're taking these. Let me back up a couple steps by isolating what's called the nodal point. The nodal point is where in your camera the image flips from right side up to upside down. It does that every time in any camera. It's part of how the lens mechanism works. It's actually how our eyes work. We're just used to seeing things right side up because our brain processes it that way. But essentially that point where the camera flips, or where the lens causes the light to flip in the camera, is the ideal point to set as the center of one of these panoramas. So rather than swinging our phones around in a circle like we all do, we should hold our phone in the same place and we should move behind our phone rather than swinging the phone. And you'll get far better results, even in things like the iPhone, if you train your body to work differently. So that's an example here. You can see it happen if you were to have an object that is close to you and an object that's far away from you. And when you swing the camera, right, let me get my little, right? So if we're looking straight on at the image, right, there's the red object in the front, there's the blue object in the back. We look straight on and they line up. If we're not swinging the camera around the nodal point, so this camera is too far forward, when we take a picture and it's off to the side, you're going to see that the red square that's close to us is here, but the blue square is way off to the left. They're no longer in alignment. If we back the camera up in this, and we isolate where that nodal point is, as we swing, we'll see the red object and the blue object stay in position. So here they are in the first image, here they are in the second image. They stay lined up. That's what we're trying to do, and that's what eliminates these little problems. So final results. We can have unrolled image. I'm going to show a bunch of these unrolled images, or you can actually create a virtual reality image or movie where you can interactively look at certain areas of the image. You could choose what it is you want to look at. This is becoming much more common in videos now, where you have 360 videos. So software, how do we process this stuff? Well, guess what? Of course, we're going to be able to process it in Photoshop. Otherwise, why would I teach it in this class? So it's great because we all have it. It can stitch small groups of images together really well. So 9 images, 12 images, it's going to do a great job. If you threw 36, 48 images at it, it's going to have a lot harder time. It also struggles with stitching a full panorama. So if you took 12 images that went all the way around in a full 360 and you tried to stitch it together, Photoshop would have a hard time because it doesn't know where to cut the panorama when it unrolls it. And so it struggles with that. So it's always better to have like a half when it comes to Photoshop. So what do you do if you want a full 360? Well, there's two software programs. They work very similar to each other. They work on the same backbone. PTGUI is one and Huggin is the other. And essentially it will allow you to pick certain points of an image and it will customize and warp these images together as you combine them together. It's built on this PanoTools backbone. Huggin is a free one. So if this is something you're interested in, you can download this and play around with it for free. It's a little bit slower than the PTGUI one, the one that I showed before, but it's essentially the same piece of software. And so it isolates and finds these similarity points. So you could see it in this live image, right? There's a point, there's a point, there's a point. Next image over, there's those same 3 points. And then it lines these two images up and stitches them together as a result. So if it's something you want to play around with, by all means, download it and try it out. Google Street View is another example that kind of stitches these together. It shows you where you're supposed to take each image. You can then post it online. You can share your Street View. It works great when you're outside. When you're inside, not so much. Funny thing, a long time ago, I took one of these. I was playing around with this, and I took one of these on a beach in Hawaii. And I said, oh, why not? I'll just take it. And I posted it online. Forgot all about it. I got a notification a couple years ago that I think it was like 150,000 people had viewed the picture. It's just kind of crazy. Anyway, it's pretty simple to use and certainly something that you could play around with if you want to. Then we have the 360 video. This is the same idea as the still photos that I'm talking about. The difference being that you're shooting video in 360 degrees. And when you do that, you could wear a headset, you could wear a virtual reality rig, and as you're watching the playback of this video, you can actually choose what it is you're looking at, which is kind of an innovative, interesting concept. I think it's something that will find more and more uses as we go forward, but I like to introduce it as a concept nonetheless. So let's look at some examples. These are all primarily panoramas that I shot. I ended up doing my grad school thesis centered around panoramas and whatever. So a couple things to point out. You have to be very careful about your exposures when you're working with multiple images, because if you end up with a dark image, like this one here, you'll end up with these weird artifacts. This is, of course, something you can fix in Photoshop. You can clean that up after the fact, but it's worth pointing out that that is a potential problem. If you see an image that has these little scallops, where it goes like this, that's a series of images that have been stitched together without going a full 360 vertical or horizontal. So that's the full image. So each one of these, that's like an individual image. And that's then stitched with this next one. That's there. And then this one here is an image that's overlaid on top of that. So you can start to see how those images stack and overlay. And again, we'll do that live in a little bit. But you can get a really good sense of place. Get a really good sense of what it's like to be in a particular place. If you miss a photo, you'll end up with a hole. Now, again, that's something you could fix in Photoshop after the fact, but it's worth trying to capture all of the images. The other thing is that when things are circular, in reality, they appear straight in a panorama. When they're straight in a panorama, they appear circular. So this image, we've got a whole bunch of these lines that are roughly straight. Well, it was taken at the center of this, looking around. So it's a perfect example of how curved objects become straight lines. Right there. Straight lines, like the walls in this, become curved. So you can see this wall right here that's curved in front of us. That's a straight line. There it is right there. So that wall is in reality straight. This is one of the examples that I will give you to play around with if you want. It's a full 360. It's in Ollantaytambo, Peru. And one of the cool things is you have really high resolution because it's stitched together with so many individual images. You can actually zoom in and look way across the canyon at this site over here. So you can play around with that a little bit later. It's one of the samples that I'll give you. Sometimes you make little mistakes. A pair of shoes. So the same thing that happens with HDR photography, where we're fusing multiple images, happens with panoramic photography as well. So you may have ghosting like this, where people that are walking through a space become ghosts. And you may have places where people disappear altogether. I've got a slide and a couple more that I'll show you. Again, this is an example of exposure matters. So my exposure for the upper part of Worcester Hall here wasn't done correctly. So you end up with these kind of artifacting problems. The night version of it showed up a lot better. Here's one that we played around with. This is pretty entertaining. This is me back when I had hair. This was in college. This was in about 2003 or so. Actually, if you look carefully, you should check out the computers in the lab. There's an old eMac right there, right? There's Windows. It's probably like Windows 98 or Windows. I bet it wasn't XP yet. Kind of crazy, but this is a good example of how panoramas work when we're stitching multiple images together, and that is the fact that we can show up over and over in the same image. So we did this as kind of fun, but there I am, here I am looking, there I am as a ghost, right? So you could see me repeated. My friend who was also in this right here, he's repeated several times across the image as well. So we're playing around with the idea of being able to fuse multiple images together, right? Here's an example of a panorama where we had somebody move through the scene and we have a completely headless body because people are moving around. So same problems exist when you're looking at HDR fusing that happen here in the panorama fusing. Anytime you're fusing images from multiple locations. You can shoot these by hand. This was one that I shot as a series. I remember isolating that nodal point, swinging my body around the camera rather than the camera around my body. This is on the Brooklyn Bridge. And you could stitch them together after the fact and get great results. I'm just going to start flipping through some of these. So panoramas were something that I got really obsessed with and really interested in using and working with. So I took tons and tons of these images over time. You can get creative with how they're unrolled. They don't have to be unrolled straight. These are a bunch from my actual thesis that had to do with SFO. And you guys don't need to spend a lot of time looking at this. Right? And these were some of the drawings that I did. And I actually had to teach myself how to draw in these panoramic perspectives. So the idea that these lines are all swinging, I had to be able to do drawings based on my section drawings here. So it ended up being kind of a fun challenge. This drawing, the full version of this ended up being about 20 feet long. That's part of it. Here's part of it. And this was where I had one image and then I had panoramas that were being projected on walls that were going in the opposite directions. So you can see how they kind of play together. Right, like that. So it's an interesting setup and conceptually how you would draw something. So now we're going to end with the last topic here, and that is blending modes in Photoshop. And we're going to do demos of all three of these as we go forward. So let's look at blending modes in Photoshop. Blending modes are similar to how you would apply transparency or opacity to various layers. We're just going to control how that's applied. And I think the best way of kind of describing this is, let's say, for example, you did a drawing on a piece of paper, and then you took a piece of white trace paper and you put it down on the drawing. It lightens the drawing, and then you could draw on top of it a little bit more. That's fundamentally different than taking a piece of yellow tracing paper and putting it down on top of your drawing. So they're still applying a transparency, they're still applying an opacity, but it's a different way of applying it. That's what blending modes do. They control how we apply this opacity, or how one layer applies to another layer in Photoshop. So we're going to do that using these groups. Blending modes are divided into fundamental groups. The first two are what are considered to be the normal groups. Then we have this next section here. That's all the tools that darken the image. Then we have a section here of tools that lighten the image. And then we have a set of tools that both lighten and darken the image at once. And then everything below that is all kind of specialty tools. Unfortunately, these names don't always correspond to what happens. So we could look at overlay, for example, and that means nothing. But it is something that's going to be very, very common as we go forward. So what are the most commonly used ones? For darkening, we're going to focus on multiply. For lightening an image, we're going to focus on screen. And for contrast, we're primarily going to use overlay, though we might use soft light just a little bit. Those are the most common ones. So multiply, screen, and overlay. So let's look at some illustrations. And this is one that's really hard. I'm going to have you do this, and I actually give you this sample file, and we'll do it together as part of our demonstrations today. There are two layers here in Photoshop. The first layer is this piece right here. Right? That's layer 1. And it's on top of this background, which is 100% blue, just a plain blue. And when we put those together so that one on top of the other, there we are, they show up like this. And because they're perfectly opaque right now, the black shows up in front, the gray shows up in front, the white shows up in front, and we see our little transparency slider. So now, if we take and turn the multiply layer onto the top, right? So here we go. If we take this layer and we change its blending mode to multiply, when we do that, this is going to happen. Let's see. There we go. So when we do that, the dark areas of our top image, the blacks, retain black and become darker. Similar right here, right here. The medium grays, so this is the medium gray, this is the medium gray, they make the blue darker than it would otherwise be. And the white, here's the white area, this is the white area, they become completely transparent. So kind of interesting. The darks become darker, the whites become transparent. That's on a multiply layer. If we do the same thing with screen, there's screen this time. When we apply it, the light areas are going to get lighter or stay white, and the dark areas are going to become transparent. So there we are. Turns out in this slide, I didn't use 100% black. It's really a dark gray, so we still see a little bit of ghosting there. It's not fully transparent. Right, that's right here. But the white areas stay white. The medium grays become kind of a light blue, but they're lightening in general. And the black areas, way back here, those are going to become completely transparent. And that's with a screen. So screen, the light areas get lighter, and the dark areas become transparent. It's exactly the opposite of the multiply blending mode. Then we have the middle one. This is overlay. So we change that middle version to overlay, the blending mode. And when that happens, guess what? The middle, this one, should become transparent. And the darks, right? The blacks should become darker, and the lights should become lighter. So let's look at that happen. There we go. The mediums become transparent, the whites become lighter, and the blacks become darker. So the first one, which was multiply, blacks get dark, whites become transparent. Screen, flip it around, blacks become transparent, whites become lighter. And finally, overlay, blacks become blacker, whites become whiter, or lights become lighter, and the medium, the middle, stays transparent. So why is this important? Oops. How did I lose my... Oh, come on. Is that the end of my... Is that it? Yeah, apparently that's it. So now I can actually do it in a live session. So we're going to keep going here. I'm going to let me minimize my my slide. Alana, you said, what do we do with our low body feet when we turn? Sorry, I missed that in the chat. Essentially, you can keep your feet in the same place. The key is to just move yourself around the camera. So try to keep the camera in the same place and shuffle your feet around or twist your body so that you're keeping the camera in the same place. Okay, so on with our work here. This is our exercise 105, 106. I've gone ahead and I pulled it up. I also opened up the ET Lab remote desktop so that I'm using that. And that way it'll look the same. I have my keystrokes being logged, etc., for your purposes. So what I want you to do is I want you to log into the exercise 105, 106, and then you're going to download this ps-blendingmodes.psd. Now, when I do that, I want to right click on it and say save link as. And this is going to let me save it. I want to save it onto my flash drive. Let's go into my demonstrations here. This is fall of 2022. And then I'll go ahead and click on save. Okay, now some of you have run into this problem already. You'll start running into it much more frequently going forward. And that is that Chrome doesn't always let you download the image. So I look down here on the left, it says can't be downloaded securely. Don't hit discard, click this little up arrow and choose keep. In which case it'll actually download. That's great. Once you have it downloaded, you can go ahead and open it. I'm going to show it in its folder. There it is. And I'll go ahead and double click on it to open. And it's going to open up Photoshop. Oh, looks like I have to sign in. There we go. And so this should look exactly the same as what I was showing you in lecture. So let's go and review how this process works. So again, we're working with layer one. We have a blue background. See, there it is. Then we have on top of it, we have these colored squares and the gradient. Ignore layer 2 and layer 3 for right now. And we're going to be changing the blending mode on layer 1 right here. So when I change the blending mode on layer 1, I select it, so it's highlighted. And then I'll come up here, it says normal right now. I'm going to change that blending mode from normal into multiply. And you can actually see it kind of live preview. When I go to multiply, the white becomes transparent and the darks become darker. If I were to switch down into screen, the lights become lighter and the blacks become transparent. And finally, we can come down here into our overlay mode where the middle stays the same and the lights become lighter and the darks become darker. So one of the ways that this can be advantageous, let's go ahead and turn this off for a second, and that is when you end up with a line drawing. So right here on layer 2, I have a sample line drawing. And let's say that I want the white background to become transparent. Well, I can take my layer 2 and I can change the blending mode into multiply, and you'll see that the white becomes transparent, but my blacks are still there. The other two options in this scenario don't really help us. So screen, right, is letting the blue show through, which I guess could be useful. And then our overlay, it doesn't really do anything at all. Now, if we had the inverse, right, where we had white lines, and we wanted the black to become transparent, that's where switching into our screen mode, this should look an awful lot like the old school blueprints, where we had the blue paper with the white lines. And again, we're making the black of this image disappear so that we're seeing just the white lines. Okay, so this sample file is for you to play around and do the same steps that I did, just so you can kind of see what these blending modes do. You don't need to save anything on that. It's just merely for you to kind of play around with. That's the understanding blending modes part. I do have a tutorial written out, so if you need help going through how to do it, you can watch it. Obviously, you can rewatch the lecture and we'll go through it. So let's start to play around with how these can work in photography. So under part 2, multiply in a blending mode, what I'm going to ask you to do is find a Creative Commons image This is ideally like an old image that needs to be enhanced. So let's look up here. I like the, oops, that opened the wrong page. Let's see here. Search.creativecommons.org. What? Oh, look at that. It is the right page, but they've changed how it is. So I'm going to look for, under content here, I'm going to look for images, and I'm going to look for old faded photograph. And let's see what happens. Okay, so we're looking for an old faded photograph. These are a bunch of different Creative Commons licenses. The idea behind these Creative Commons images is that you can actually use them and you have rights to use them. So we can load more results here. And what we're looking for is we're looking for an older faded image. So let's say this one. There it is. Let me click on get this image. There it is. We'll zoom in. Yeah, that looks good. Let me download it. So I'm going to download the original size. And there it is. Let me show it in its folder. And I'm going to go ahead and copy it over to my flash drive so I have it. So I'm just right-clicking on the image, going to my flash drive, going to today's folder. And there we are. And we'll go ahead and paste it right here. Okay, so then let's open that up in Photoshop. So I'll come back to Photoshop and I'll go to File and then Open. And that is not the correct file. There it is. We'll click on Open. And there it is. So let's look at what happens. So I have some options here in how I apply it. The first thing that I could do is I could just duplicate this layer. So with it highlighted, the background layer, I'm going to go up to these three little lines, and I'll choose Duplicate Layer, which should be right here. Oh, it's right there. Duplicate Layer. And that just creates a copy of the original layer. Right? So we have two copies. Then I could take the copy and I could come down here into multiply. Now notice that as soon as I do that, we've transformed from this image that's kind of faded out to this image that has a lot more color and resolution in it, a lot more detail. Now, if this was too strong, you can adjust this opacity slider down. I can choose how much is applied, which may be advantageous. If it wasn't strong enough, we could do it twice. The other option that we could do is we could add a curves adjustment layer. So we could go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and we could do curves. Right? And we could swing that. And then we could apply a multiply blending mode to it. And you can see what's happening here. Furthermore, you could start to adjust the curves. So we could darken the lighter areas, lighten the darkened areas a little bit. And again, it's using kind of an inverted S on the curves layer with a multiply blending mode. So I think the easiest is just to duplicate the image and apply that blending mode to it. The alternative would be to use your curves and apply that way. But in either case, you see that I'm enhancing the shadows of this image quite a lot. So once this is done, right, I'm going to start saving these images because I'll end up posting them. So let's say I like this version of it. I go to File and then Export. Of course, I can't see it. There it is. Export, Export As. And we're going to jump it into JPEG. And again, I don't need high resolution here. So let's change the width to 1000. There it is. And then we can export it. So this was my multiply. And I'll go ahead and click on Save. So let's play around with what happens if we were to change this into the screen mode. Right, so again, we'll create a duplicate of the background. So let's have the background selected, and I'll choose duplicate layer. There it is. And on this duplicate, this one, turn this one, sorry, it's this one. I'm going to change from normal into my screen mode. So when I do that, you see that I'm getting a little bit more out of the shadows, but it's really washing out the bulk of the image. So that's less than ideal, but it is certainly an option with screen. The alternative there is that we could find an image, go back here, that instead of needing to be darkened, might need to be lightened. Now let's see, I'm looking. Maybe this one. I'm just going to open this one straight right now. There it is. So in this one, we'll duplicate it. Duplicate the layer here. And I will apply the screen mode to it. And theoretically, right, it's lightening up the detail in these people a bit. Now, again, this is always based on what the original image is and how much you can get back from what you've created. So that may be beneficial. Let's look at it under both scenarios. So we'll take this, and instead of being in screen mode, let's go into my overlay mode. And you'll see that in overlay, I'm lightening up the shadows, but I'm also darkening the dark areas. So I'm getting a little bit of both. And again, this may or may not be what you're after, but it's a little bit of both. So I've just dropped that opacity down. I could do it here as well. So we could change this into my overlay mode. And to me, that's really not helping. So you always play around with these as you're working on it. And you may find that this same strategy could work on a photograph that you took, where you're trying to selectively work on it just a little bit. So those are different blending modes as they apply to old photographs. So I'm asking you to do it. Let's come back here to 105, 106. We're going to do multiply, screen, and overlay. You should have one image saved for each one of those. You pick the best. Now let's look here under luminosity. And so this is something that works well when you have an image that's dominated with reds and/or blues. So if you go back and find one of your own images that has a lot of reds or blues in it, let's open that and see what we can do here. Go ahead and open. I'm going to go back to some sample images that I have. Let's take, we're going to end up doing HDRs with those. Let's try this one. Okay, and I want to use this luminosity blending mode. And so I do have this one written out if you get a little bit lost, right? We're going to do a curves adjustment to create a traditional S curve. And then we're going to change the blending mode to luminosity. So let's go up to our layer, new adjustment layer, curves. Go ahead and say OK. There's our curves adjustment. I'm going to peg the middle. And then I'm going to do a traditional S curve. So we'll pull this one up just a little bit. And we'll pull this one down just a little bit. There's our S. And instead of having it be a normal, we're going to change this all the way down into our luminosity. It's the last one. And you should see, there it is before, there it is after. It's really enhancing and it's pushing the colors a lot in this particular image. Let's do it again. Let me open another one. Let's pick this one. There it is. So same thing. We're going to create that curves. So let me go up to layer, new adjustment layer, curves. We'll peg the center. We'll pull this up just a little bit. Pull this one down just a little bit. There's our S curve. And then we're going to take this from being normal and we're going to drop it all the way down into luminosity. And so you should be able to see that there's the original and there's the final version. So it's kind of enhancing the detail and pushing the colors just a little bit. So that's a luminosity adjustment.
What is the adding value of the luminosity? Because you're using them together with curves, so it's hard to tell what the benefit of it.
Okay, so let's take a look. So this one is the one with the luminosity. Let me take the same curve. I'm going to duplicate it, and we'll take the luminosity away. Okay, so there's my original, and this is part of our goal today, is to show all of these and to see all of these as you're working through Photoshop. So here's my original image. If I were to do it with just the curves, this is the end result. Okay, so there it is. That's a little bit better with just the curves. Now, instead of that, we could go with the luminosity. So it's a really subtle change. Look, hold on, yeah. Okay, look at kind of the general color that's right in this area and right in that area near the sunset. And when I do this, it's not washing out. It's not getting quite so oversaturated. There it is at the oversaturation. And again, this may be something that you have to play around with and do yourself, so you can see it on your own computer. It still has a lot of detail in those clouds, where the original curves, we start to lose detail in those clouds. So it's a subtle difference. It's a very subtle difference. But theoretically, the one with the luminosity is a little bit better. And we're talking about fine adjustments here. Okay, so we've done that one. We've done the luminosity. The next thing is using it with a grunge background. And this is one that's kind of fun, and you've probably seen this happen before. And that's where you're intentionally dirtying part of the image, or you're adding a little bit of texture or grain behind an image. So what we need is we need a grunge texture. So let me go back here to my Creative Commons, and let's look for a grunge texture. And so we could pick something like this, for example. And get this image. I'm going to download it. And there it is. So this image right here is something that I can use as a texture behind an image like this. So I need to bring this image into this file. So I can do that using the place command. I'll go up to File and then Place. And I'm going to choose Place Embedded because we don't need to worry about linked files right now. And let me, I think it's still in my Downloads folder. Unfortunately, I don't remember which file it was. There we go. And we'll go ahead and place. Need to make it a little bit bigger. Like that, for example. Then I'm going to take this and this image, I'm going to apply one of the blending modes to it. So I should commit to the size first. Sorry, there we go. And now let me apply one of those. So if I went to darken, you see that it's giving me that kind of grain in front. If I went to screen, it might be the opposite. If I went to overlay, it's kind of a little bit of both. Let's go to screen, but it's significantly too strong. So let's drop the opacity way back on this. And so you can see that it's giving a little bit of background texture. I'm not sure that this was the best example. Let me try another one. Let me go to File and then Place, Embedded. And I have a folder called Resources here. And inside of that folder, I have a folder for grunge textures. And let me do one. Let's do this one. There it is. We're going to hold down Shift so it jumps into place here. Like that. And we'll go like that. So you'll see more darkening in the edges here than in the center. So with that, I'm going to switch over into multiply this time. We'll commit to the size. And then again, I have to adjust the opacity a little bit so that you're seeing that little bit of dirtying on the corners. So it's a different strategy. It may or may not be something that you're interested in doing long term, but I'm showing you that you can apply this kind of blending mode to a certain image and see how it turns out. This is actually a great opportunity to also play around with other options. So there's multiply, color burn, right? Linear burn. You can just kind of work your way through all these options and see what's happening until you find one that you like. Okay, so I'm going to stick with multiply for right now. That's my example here. Okay, so we've done that. Now we move on. We're doing the HDR image and the panoramic image. These are both pretty easy. You should, as part of your exercise 103, have taken an attempt at an HDR image. You should also have taken an attempt at a panoramic image. If you don't have either one of those, I have 3 groups of HDR samples, and I have 3 groups of panoramic images. You can play with any one of those. You just need to right-click and download. I think they save link as. I just want to make sure it works. Again, we have to say keep it. There you go, and it'll download. I already have them here, but let's go through the process. We're going to start with that merge to HDR. It's an automatic action in Photoshop, which makes life easy. We're going to go to File and then Automate, and you're going to see Merge to HDR Pro as an option. So I'm going to go to File, Automate, Merge to HDR Pro. It's going to ask me for the files. So I have to click on Browse, and I have to find those files. I already have them downloaded on my flash drive, so I don't have to go searching for them. You will have downloaded them. And let's see, I forget whether I have them in here. No, I think I are in the 106 folder. Hold on. There we go. There's HDR. Here's sample set 1. Let's play around with those. There's the 3 images, dark, medium, and light. I'm going to select all 3, and I'll say OK. Then they'll be listed 1, 2, and 3. We're going to keep the check mark for automatically align source images, and then we'll go ahead and say OK. So it's going to open the images. And it's going to work to put them together into one layer or into one file. And then we get this Merge to HDR Pro dialog box. This is the preview of what it thinks the image should look like, which is actually an awfully good combination of the 3. But we have all kinds of ways of doing this post-processing. So up here under presets, you know I like presets. You can actually go through and try several of these different presets and see which one starts to look good. And you can also see that some of these are those artistic versions. Let's go to photorealistic. Let's go to low contrast. Let's try photorealistic high contrast. And I like the low contrast a little better. We could go to saturated. Right, they have surrealistic. So you can play around with these. Okay, and I want you to go through and try the different settings. Now for me, I think the saturated was pretty close for what I was after. But notice that I also have sliders here. So I could say, you know what, this didn't turn out quite the way I wanted it. Let me bump that saturation down just a little bit. Let's lighten up the shadows just a little bit. You can see that's affecting the beach. Here, it might be more obvious in the highlights. I could darken or lighten the sky. So you could play around with these sliders to start to give you the end results that you want. So it's a pretty easy set to play around with. When you're done, you'll go ahead and say OK, and it'll fuse all of them together into your final image right there. So let's do it one more time. I'll do it with a different set of images just for practice. I'll go to File, Automate, Merge to HDR Pro. I'm going to browse for my files, and this time I'll pick a different set. You only have to do it once, but I'm doing it 3 times. We'll say OK. Say OK. And there they are. And here we are. Again, we're at the default. We could play around with all of the different examples here. Maybe I like that one. Remember, I can always adjust these values. So I could say, it's a little bit too much saturation. Let's drop that down just a little bit. Okay, I like that. See if we can lighten the shadows just a little bit on that mountain face. And this is the image that I like. When I'm done, I'll go ahead and say OK. And that then satisfies my Merge to HDR Pro. Perfect, there it is. Last piece is the panoramas. where we're combining images together. So like I said, I do have panoramic image sets. These sets are full images, or excuse me, full 360s. So you've got like 60 images. We only need a grouping of these to work in Photoshop. So again, I already have them downloaded. This is similar. We go to File and then Automate, but instead of choosing Merge to HDR Pro, we're going to choose Photomerge. So I'll go ahead and click on Photomerge. And you see that the Photomerge dialog box is a little bit different, but it's again asking us for image source files. So let's click on Browse. I'm going to go into my panoramas. There's the 3 different examples. Let's use this one. And I'm going to pick some groups of images. So let's go those. Now let's just do that group and see how it corresponds. It's not letting me deselect some of these. I would like to deselect some. Let's see. This is a Windows Mac thing. So we'll just do that. Well, we'll try it through there, see what happens. And I'll go ahead and say, okay. There's the images. We do look down here at the options. We want to blend the images together. And these other pieces are probably okay, though we could check the box for content aware fill transparent areas. Let's go ahead and say okay, and let's see how it does. Now this is going to take a little bit longer than that merge to HDR Pro. So we have to be a little bit patient here. And I know I'm running a few minutes over, so bear with me for a little bit longer. If you have to go, you have to go. But I'd like to get this fully sorted out. All right. So it did a pretty good job of stitching these images together for us. Right? So it took all those individual images and lined them up. But let's look. I'm going to turn off the merge for just a second. And I want to look at these individual layers. So you see that these individual layers also have this little black box next to them. And what that means is that Photoshop has determined that, let me turn all of these off, that this image, these are the pieces that are relevant in this photo merge. And it's used what's called a mask to control what parts of the image are shown. Let me zoom in here. Oops. Wrong. Forget that I'm on Windows when I'm doing this. There we go. Okay. So the whole image is right there. So that's the whole image. It's been distorted a little bit. It's been warped. But then Photoshop applies a mask such that only these are the pieces that are used. Then we turn on the next image in the series, this one, and it also has a mask applied. So if we look at and disable the mask, there's the whole image, but we're instead only showing this little piece of the image like that. And so once those are put together, you can't tell where that seam is because Photoshop has determined the best place to stitch it together. If I kept turning it on, before you know it, you'd end up with the full image. Right? So once again, there's this piece. If I were to disable the layer mask, there's the whole image. Let's re-enable the layer mask. And there's that piece. So this is kind of an early introduction to layer mask. Next class, we'll spend a lot more time with layer mask. Again, all I'm asking you to do is to stitch some of the images together to get some result like this. When you're done here, we'll once again go up to File and then Export and Export As. There it is. Again, we don't need a lot of resolution here, so we can do maybe 1,000. It'll be a little tiny. That's fine. And we'll go ahead and click on Export, and you'll save it today. This would be Panorama. Like that. Okay, so I know it's a lot to go through, but again, these don't involve too many like specific operations. It's more about exploring these as concepts. Okay, so at the end today, when you go to post on Canvas, you should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 images. Oh, look, I totaled it up there, right? You should have 7 images that you're going to post in your Canvas post. Just documentation that you've done all of these. Okay, so I'm going to let you guys go. Let me stop the share for a second here. Don't forget, this week we do have our mandatory check-ins. We're back on that schedule. No holiday this week. We're setting up like normal. So you need to show up to one of the sessions, either today or on Wednesday, your choice. I'm going to take a quick break. So I'm going to start the first session a little bit late. I'll start that one at 9:15. So you're welcome to stick around if you want, or if you want to come, leave and come back, that's okay too. Remember, it's the same Zoom link, so everything will be left open. You just come and I'll get you checked off.